executive decision making under political pressure. The call before dawn. At 4:37 a.m., the chief's phone rings. An officer involved shooting from the night before is already moving across social media. By sunrise, the mayor wants a briefing. By 8 a.m., union representatives are warning against throwing officers under the bus. By 9 a.m., community activists are demanding immediate transparency. By noon, city council members are asking whether the chief still has control of the department. No one is asking for the chief's comfort. Everyone is asking for the chief's judgment. This is what executive decision making under political pressure looks like. It is rarely a tidy choice between good and bad options. More often, it is a contest between competing obligations: loyalty to personnel, duty to the law, accountability to the public, expectations from elected officials, media scrutiny, and the long-term legitimacy of the institution itself. Police executives operate in a public sector environment fundamentally different from private sector leadership. Unlike a CEO, a police chief answers not only to internal performance demands, but also to the public, often through a mayor, city manager, or council, while also navigating unions, civil service structures, and community expectations. For aspiring supervisors, current sergeants, lieutenants, and executives, this topic matters because political pressure does not begin at the chief's office. First-line supervisors feel it when command direction shifts under public criticism. Lieutenants feel it when they must translate executive intent downward while preserving credibility. Executives feel it most acutely because they are the final human filter between external pressure and organizational action. If they make poor decisions, the consequences are not abstract. They can damage officer trust, community confidence, legal defensibility, morale, legitimacy, and public safety all at once. In policing, where public support and perceived fairness help determine whether people defer to police authority, poor executive judgment under pressure can make effective policing significantly harder. Understanding this subject is not about becoming political in the manipulative sense. It is about learning how to remain principled, disciplined, and strategically clear when powerful people, urgent events, and public emotions all attempt to compress your decision-making window. That is the real executive task. Historical and intellectual background. The intellectual roots of executive decision-making under pressure come from several streams: public administration, psychology, behavioral economics, and leadership studies. One foundational idea comes from Herbert Simon's concept of bounded rationality. Simon challenged the fantasy that leaders calmly evaluate every option with perfect information and then choose the optimal solution. Decision makers operate with limited time, limited information, limited cognitive bandwidth, and limited control over their environment. Simon distinguished between ideal rationality and what he called more procedural forms of rationality, in which a sound decision depends on whether an appropriate process was followed under the circumstances. This matters enormously in policing because executives rarely decide under ideal conditions. They decide under ambiguity, speed, emotion, and institutional constraint. A second major influence comes from Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's work on judgment under uncertainty. Kahneman's Nobel-recognized research helped establish prospect theory, showing that people do not weigh gains and losses symmetrically. They tend to feel losses more intensely than equivalent gains. Under political pressure, leaders can become overly focused on avoiding immediate, visible losses, bad headlines, criticism from elected officials, short-term unrest, internal backlash, even when that avoidance produces greater long-term damage. Executives may preserve today's optics while sacrificing tomorrow's legitimacy. A third stream comes from research on groupthink, especially Irving Janis's work. Janis argued that cohesive groups under pressure often suppress dissent, narrow their options, and mistake agreement for correctness. In executive teams, this is especially dangerous. A command staff meeting can become less a place for analysis than a place for silent compliance, especially when the issue is politically hot and the leader is anxious to move quickly. Groupthink does not just produce bad decisions. It produces bad decisions that feel justified in the moment because they are socially reinforced. A fourth and particularly important stream comes from policing research on legitimacy, procedural justice, and organizational justice. Tom Tyler and others help push police leadership thinking beyond simple compliance and toward legitimacy. The idea that people are more likely to accept authority when they perceive it as fair, neutral, respectful, and trustworthy. That logic applies externally with the public and internally with employees. NIJ and PERF have both emphasized that organizational justice inside the agency and procedural justice outside the agency are not side issues. They are central to police leadership. In other words, how executives make decisions and how fairly those decisions are communicated shapes whether employees and the public believe in them. Over time, these traditions have converged into a more realistic understanding of leadership. Executives are not detached, rational actors. They are public decision makers operating within systems of stress, politics, perception, and moral consequence. That is why modern executive leadership in policing requires more than command presence or technical competence. It requires discipline, judgment, core concepts, and principles. One political pressure is not the same as corruption. Political pressure is unavoidable in public leadership. Corruption is not. A police executive works in a political environment because policing is a public function, funded by taxpayers, overseen by elected or appointed officials, and judged by communities. Pressure becomes unethical when it demands favoritism, selective enforcement, concealment, retaliation, or decisions detached from law, policy, facts, and principle. A mature executive does not confuse all political input with illegitimate interference. A mayor asking about public confidence, a council member asking about resource allocation, or community leaders pressing for more transparency are not necessarily compromising the mission. These are normal features of democratic governance. OECD public integrity frameworks emphasize that good governance depends on systems of assessment, accountability, stakeholder involvement, and integrity protections. The challenge is not eliminating pressure. It is responding to it without surrendering judgment. The executive's job is to absorb pressure, not transmit it raw. One of the least discussed but most important executive functions is pressure filtration. When external actors panic, posture, threaten, or grandstand, the executive's role is not to dump that emotional energy downward into the organization. It is to translate it into lawful, ethical, operationally sound action. This is where many executives fail. They become amplifiers of pressure rather than managers of it. A chief who receives criticism from City Hall and immediately lashes out at command staff, rushes investigations, changes discipline standards, or issues contradictory guidance is not leading. That chief is merely channeling anxiety. Strong executives create distance between external turbulence and internal decision-making. That distance protects fairness and improves quality. Stress changes how leaders think. This is not just metaphorical. stress has measurable effects on executive cognition. Research on the prefrontal cortex shows that even relatively mild, acute, uncontrollable stress can rapidly impair higher-order cognitive functions. Reviews of decision-making under stress also show a tendency toward a shift from analytic reasoning to more intuitive, habitual, and emotionally reactive responses. Under stress, people are more likely to rely on initial judgments, habitual patterns, and gut feelings rather than flexible, goal-directed reasoning. For an executive, that means political pressure can quietly degrade the very capacities the moment requires most: impulse control, working memory, perspective taking, prioritization, and long-range thinking. The chief who says, "I know I'm under pressure, but I can still think clearly," may be sincere and still wrong. One practical lesson follows. Executives must design decision processes that compensate for the cognitive effects of stress rather than assume they are immune to them. For legitimacy is a decision variable. Many leaders treat legitimacy as a communications issue to be managed after a decision. Legitimacy should be treated as part of the decision itself. PERF and NIJ materials repeatedly emphasize that fairness, transparency, procedural justice, and internal organizational justice are central to effective police leadership. Research has also shown that procedural justice training can improve officer behavior, reduce disrespectful treatment, improve community evaluations, and, in one multi-city randomized trial, even reduce arrests and crime at study locations. This does not mean every legitimate decision will be popular. It means decisions should be evaluated partly by whether they preserve the institution's moral and operational credibility. A politically expedient decision that destroys internal trust or public confidence may win the afternoon and lose the decade. 5. Timing matters, but so does tempo. Executives often ask, "How fast do we need to decide?" The better question is, what tempo does this decision require? Some issues require immediate action to stabilize risk. Others require deliberate delay to gather facts, create procedural fairness, and avoid irreversible error. The modern communications environment complicates this. PERF's work on police chiefs is defining moments, notes that in major incidents, a public narrative forms within hours, whether police contribute to it or not. Chiefs, therefore, need to get out in front of the story with preliminary information while acknowledging that facts may evolve. Strategic communication research from COPS similarly notes that thorny issues involving chiefs, political leaders, employees, and the public are complicated by competing interests, timing, and the advantage gained by whoever frames the issue first. The executive lesson is subtle. Acting too slowly can create an information vacuum, but acting too fast on the substance can create procedural and legal problems. Communication speed and substantive decision speed are not always the same thing. Research and expert insights, stress, habit, and narrowing of thought. Behavioral research strongly suggests that stress does not merely make decision-making harder. It changes the style of decision-making. Under stress, leaders often become more rigid, less exploratory, and more dependent on habit. That can be adaptive in immediate survival conditions, but it is dangerous in politically complex environments where the wrong fast decision can reshape a department's culture or public credibility. The brain's shift away from reflective control and toward reflexive responding means executives should distrust their own certainty when stress is high and dissent is low. Fair process affects compliance and engagement. Police leadership research has increasingly shown that fairness inside the organization matters. A study of police officers' work engagement found that supervisor support, and supervisor justice had a positive effect on work engagement, and that support plus justice explained a meaningful share of the variation in engagement. Separate burnout research found that organizational justice, distributive, procedural, and interactional, acted as a protective factor against police burnout. That matters because executives under political pressure often default to unilateral or symbolic actions that may satisfy external audiences but degrade internal perceptions of fairness. Over time, that erodes engagement, trust, and resilience. Legitimacy and public cooperation. PERF and NIJ materials consistently frame procedural justice and legitimacy as leadership essentials rather than public relations add-ons. Communities are less likely to defer to police authority when they do not perceive police actions as neutral, fair, and respectful. Without public support, policing becomes much more difficult. This is especially important under political pressure because the temptation is to manage controversy through force, secrecy, or rhetorical defensiveness. But research and practitioner guidance point in a different direction. Legitimacy is not a luxury for calm periods. It is an operational asset in crisis. Governance requires collaboration without operational capture. COP's guidance on accountability emphasizes that chiefs, mayors or city managers, and city councils must collaborate to ensure ethical standards and accountability, while municipal executives should not intervene with agency operations. That is an important distinction. Democratic oversight is proper. Operational capture is not. Executives need enough political skill to maintain effective relationships with governing authorities while preserving the department's legal, ethical, and professional independence. The public sector executive is structurally different. PERF's adaptation of good to great to policing makes an important point. Non-business leaders do not possess the concentrated decision power of private CEOs. Police chiefs answer to the public and often to political authorities, while unions and civil service systems further limit unilateral action. This structural reality means that executive success in policing depends partly on what might be called legislative skill, persuasion, coalition management, timing, relationship building, and the ability to navigate competing stakeholders without abandoning principle. Real-world application. Consider 3 common scenarios. Scenario 1. The high-visibility discipline case. An officer is involved in a controversial incident. The video is partial. Public demand for discipline is immediate. City Hall wants action. The union warns of grievance exposure. The media wants a simple answer. A weak executive asks, "What decision will reduce criticism by tonight?" A stronger executive asks, "What immediate decisions are necessary for safety, transparency, and integrity, and what decisions must wait for due process?" Those are different questions. The first is politically driven. The second is institutionally driven. In practice, this might mean the immediate administrative relief of duty if justified, early public acknowledgement of the incident, a transparent outline of the investigative process, frequent communication with governing officials, and strict resistance to premature conclusions. The executive neither stonewalls nor prejudges. This protects public trust without sacrificing fairness. Scenario 2. Budget cuts and staffing reduction. Political leadership directs substantial budget cuts. Employees fear layoffs. The community fears longer response times. The union frames the issue as abandonment of public safety. COP's communication guidance notes that these are thorny decisions involving competing interests among officers, chiefs, political leaders, and the public, and that whoever frames the issue first may gain an advantage. An executive response, therefore, requires both operational analysis and message discipline. The chief needs to define likely service impacts honestly, avoid emotional overstatement, brief employees before possible public release when appropriate, and keep city leadership aligned on facts and language. The deeper principle is that political pressure often rewards exaggeration. Executive discipline requires refusing that reward. Overstating catastrophe for leverage may create short-term political advantage and long-term credibility loss. Scenario 3. Reform demand after a major incident. After a nationally resonant event, local activists and elected officials demand immediate reforms. Policy changes, training mandates, civilian review expansion, public dashboards, and disciplinary restructuring. This is a classic trap for both overreaction and paralysis. The executive's task is to separate symbolic urgency from operational sequencing. Some reforms can and should move quickly. Others require legal review, labor analysis, resource planning, and staff training. The executive who promises everything immediately may later fail publicly. The executive who dismisses all reform as political theater may lose legitimacy and trust. The better path is staged reform. Acknowledge concerns, identify non-negotiable principles, announce immediate review steps, create timelines, and communicate what can change now versus what requires process. Common misunderstandings and mistakes. Mistake 1. Confusing calm with passivity. Some leaders believe resisting political pressure means not reacting, but non-response can be its own reaction. Perf's work on critical incidents makes clear that when police do not help define the narrative early, others will. Calm leadership is not silent leadership. It is measured, fact-bound, timely leadership. Mistake 2. Mistaking popularity for legitimacy. A decision can be loudly applauded and still be organizationally unsound. It can also be harshly criticized and still be correct. Legitimacy is not the same as approval. It is grounded in fairness, neutrality, consistency, respectful treatment, and defensible process. The executive question is not, will everyone like this? But, can this be defended ethically, operationally, legally, and procedurally? Mistake 3. Letting politics justify inconsistency. Nothing erodes credibility faster than selective standards. When executives punish one employee harshly because a case is public but handle a similar private case leniently, everyone notices. Internally, that damages organizational justice. Externally, it eventually damages trust as well. Mistake 4. Over-personalizing criticism. Political pressure often feels personal, but executives who interpret every challenge as a loyalty test make worse decisions. They narrow input, punish dissent, and drift toward groupthink. Under pressure, leaders need more honest disagreement, not less. Groupthink research is clear that pressure, cohesion, narrow information flow, and conformity pressures can produce bad collective judgment. Mistake 5. Thinking integrity alone is sufficient. Character matters, but integrity without process is not enough. Good people still make poor decisions when tired, threatened, rushed, isolated, or emotionally flooded. Ethical intention must be supported by decision architecture. A practical framework. The stable model. To make this chapter actionable, here is a practical framework for executive decision making under political pressure. Stable. S. Separate the pressure from the problem. Name the actual decision. Then separately name the pressures surrounding it. Media cycle, mayoral concern, union pressure, activist demands, personnel morale, and litigation risk. Until you separate these, the loudest pressure will impersonate the problem. Key question: what must be decided today? T. Test for facts, authority, and time. Clarify what is known, unknown, and unknowable right now. Identify who has authority over what. Distinguish between immediate stabilization decisions and decisions that require investigation or consultation. Key question: what decision is reversible and what decision is irreversible? Assess legitimacy impact. Before deciding, evaluate the likely impact on internal trust, public confidence, fairness, and consistency. Treat legitimacy as a substantive criterion, not an afterthought. Key question: if I explain this decision publicly and internally, will it sound principled and consistent? B. Build disciplined dissent. Bring in a small number of trusted voices who will challenge assumptions. Ask one person to argue the strongest case against your preferred decision. This is a practical defense against groupthink and stress-driven certainty. Key question: what am I most likely missing because I want this over with? L. Lead the communication, not just the decision. Decide what must be said now, to whom, and in what order. In politically charged events, sequencing matters. Governing authority, internal command, workforce, public, media, and community partners. Speak early enough to frame reality, but not so fast that you create avoidable factual error. Key question: what can I say now that is true, useful, and responsibly limited? E. Evaluate after action. After the pressure wave passes, conduct a disciplined review. What did politics distort? Where did the process hold? Where did it buckle? Did the organization experience the decision as fair? Did the public understand the rationale? This is how executive judgment compounds over time. Key question: what must be institutionalized before the next crisis? The value of stable is not that it eliminates pressure. It creates a repeatable method for leading through it without becoming owned by it. Reflective insights. Executive decision making under political pressure is not merely a technical skill. It is a moral and relational practice. First, it forces leaders to confront a difficult truth. Power changes perception. The higher the rank, the more filtered the information becomes. People edit themselves around executives. Praise arrives early. Warning arrives late. Under political pressure, this distortion intensifies because subordinates often try to protect the leader or align with the emerging narrative. That is why executive humility is not cosmetic. It is operationally necessary. Second, the topic raises a classic ethical tension between prudence and principle. Prudence asks what is feasible now in the real environment. Principle asks what is right regardless of convenience. Mature executive judgment does not discard either. A chief who acts on principle without prudence may become ineffective and isolated. A chief who acts on prudence without principle may remain in position while hollowing out the institution. The work is to hold both. Third, political pressure reveals what the organization truly believes about fairness. If discipline becomes more severe only when cameras are present, employees learn that fairness is conditional. If community engagement becomes urgent only during a scandal, the public learns that respect is tactical. If elected officials support accountability only after embarrassment, everyone learns that ethics are reactive. Over time, these patterns create cynicism. Fourth, leaders should recognize that some pressure is not a nuisance, but a democratic signal. Public concern, governing oversight, community anger, and demands for explanation are part of what it means to exercise authority in a free society. The executive's responsibility is not to resent scrutiny, but to meet it with steadiness, transparency, and lawful judgment. Finally, this topic has a deep human dimension. Under pressure, leaders are often lonely. They absorb outrage from every direction. They disappoint people no matter what they choose. Preventing executive isolation is therefore not self-indulgence. It is a judgment safeguard. Wise executives cultivate a small circle of principled advisors before the crisis, not during it. Key lessons and takeaways. Political pressure is normal in public leadership. Surrendering principle to it is not. Police executives operate under bounded rationality, not perfect information. Stress degrades higher-order thinking and increases reliance on habit, intuition, and narrow framing. Legitimacy is not a public relations issue after the fact. It is part of the decision itself. Fair internal process affects engagement, burnout, and trust among officers. Public trust depends heavily on perceptions of fairness, neutrality, and respectful treatment. Oversight and collaboration with governing authorities are necessary. Operational capture is not. Communication speed and substantive decision speed are different things. Groupthink becomes more likely when urgency, cohesion, and leader certainty rise together. Executives should build decision processes that preserve clarity, dissent, and consistency under pressure. Conclusion. The weight and worth of steady judgment. Executive decision-making under political pressure is where leadership loses its romance and shows its substance. This is the arena where rank, intelligence, and experience are tested by scrutiny, speed, fear, and competing loyalties. In those moments, the executive cannot rely on charisma, slogans, or positional authority alone. What matters is disciplined thought, ethical steadiness, procedural fairness, and the ability to absorb pressure without transmitting panic. For aspiring supervisors, this chapter points forward. The habits that protect executive judgment later are built earlier. Clarity, emotional control, intellectual humility, fairness, documentation, and the courage to hear unwelcome truth. For current sergeants and lieutenants, this is a reminder that every level of leadership is training for the next. For executives, the lesson is even sharper. Your organization learns from how you decide under pressure what kind of institution it really is. In the end, political pressure is not the real enemy. Unexamined, fear is. Ego is. Hurry is. Isolation is. The executive leader's task is not to eliminate pressure from public service. That is impossible. The task is to become the kind of leader who can stand under pressure without bending truth, fairness, or judgment to fit the moment. That is not only good leadership. In policing, it is one of the clearest forms of institutional stewardship.